want to thank Helen for the introduction, and also to thank the Socialist Party in England and Wales and here in London for inviting me to speak tonight on what I think is an important subject for the working class movement and the socialist movement internationally. Now, the Occupy movement has shaken U.S. society to its very core. It's hard really to overstate the effect that the Occupy movement has had on discussions in society and on the potential for struggles going forward. And the reason for this is the backdrop that gave birth to these slogans about the 1% and the 99%, which is the massive jaw-dropping inequality in U.S. society that is more and more engulfing more and more of the population, and from that, the boiling class anger from below that exists throughout the U.S. Just a few polls and statistics to bring this to life. Over half of the people in the U.S. are either in poverty or near poverty. Now, for many countries, that wouldn't be a shocking statistic. But what's held up is the leading light, the hope that everyone should have in international capitalism to provide a future for humanity, a future free of exploitation, and a future free of impoverishment. This country that they've held up for so long, for so many decades, has at its core that severe poverty and exploitation faced by half the population. At the same time that people see this in their everyday lives, they've also seen the events of billions and hundreds of billions of dollars being spent on two wars that were extremely unpopular in U.S. society. At the same time that they see their schools being shut down, that they see their libraries being shut down, that they see their public sector unions under attack. Does that sound familiar? They also see trillions of dollars, literally, having been handed directly to the big banks or through the back door in big bank bailouts. And these bank bailouts were so unpopular in U.S. society that without any engine to actually use to oppose them, because the trade union movement, of course, was silent on the issue, there was a massive outpouring of opposition through no organized channels that actually stopped the bank bailouts for 2 days. This is something that's forgotten because of just an outpouring of unorganized anger and massive discontent. A recent poll in the last 2 weeks of people in the U.S. found that 2/3 of people see the main conflict in society as being a class conflict between the rich and the poor. It's quite amazing for a country that went through all the Cold War propaganda and the massive post-war boom as well. But even more amazing are the stats about how people view socialism and capitalism in the U.S. Among young people and amongst African Americans, socialism is viewed more favorably than capitalism, right? This is despite the fact that there is no organized force in U.S. society arguing for socialism. Socialism, when it comes into the discussion in the education system, in the media, etc., it is only wholly and fully portrayed in a negative way. Yet, in a confused way, people, socialism may not necessarily mean what it actually is to the people voting for it in the poll, but still, that is a massive amount of significance that only half, that so many people would view socialism more favorably than capitalism. And of course, the international events have had a massive impact on U.S. society, and had a massive direct impact on what was the first occupation of this movement that's exploded in the last year. Now, it's often looked at as the first occupation, right? This little one in Zuccotti Park in Wall Street. No, the first occupation in the U.S. this year that kicked off the massive outpouring of class anger was the huge working class uprising in Wisconsin earlier this year. They occupied the state capitol not once, they occupied the state capitol not twice, but 3 times, forcing their way through against the state that was trying to stop them. This was in response to the anti-trade union legislation that was being passed by a Tea Party governor, but it was also directly and more importantly in response to the inspiring events of Egypt, to the inspiring events in Tunisia as well. And I remember I went to Wisconsin 4 times, but before I'd gone out there once, one of the members of Socialist Alternative called me up and he said, "Oh, you wouldn't believe all these signs about comparing Governor Walker to Mubarak, and everyone's inspired by the Egyptian struggle with Egyptian flags and all this." And I thought, he's maybe losing his head a little bit. But then you go and you see it yourself, and you see farmers on tractors with signs with Mubarak and Walker crossed out. And actually, the first occupation of the state capitol, it's not a mistake that the first occupation of the state capitol in Wisconsin happened on the very exact same day that news was announced in the US that Mubarak had fallen. And that's what inspired and will continue to inspire the young people and working class in the US to continue to struggle. And we have to say that this Occupy movement is only the beginning of a whole era of coming struggles in the US and, more importantly, around the world. Now, just to touch on Wisconsin, because I think it's worth going into depth on, and nobody's written on this issue on Wisconsin in depth, because most friends in the labor movement that have the capacity to write about Wisconsin in depth have no legacy that they want to defend in what happened in Wisconsin. And because of this, the first book that's going to be produced about Wisconsin is actually going to come from Socialist Alternative, because it's the only trend within the labor movement that actually has a leg to stand on when talking about the events. The scale of the uprising was absolutely transformative in such an incredible way that every single coffee shop in Madison was occupied with discussions about how do we take the movement forward, how do we defeat Walker, what does this mean about the struggle throughout the country for working class people, to the point that small businesses had signs in their windows that said, "We support a general strike in Wisconsin." At the same time, and this reflected the fact that ordinary workers in Wisconsin supported the need for a general strike, to the point that when the third occupation of the Capitol happened, people came in and started chanting, "General strike, general strike, general strike." This forced the trade union leaders who've been arguing against a general strike all along, and what we called for was a one-day public sector general strike as a start to build a movement that could defeat Walker. They decided they had to have an emergency meeting amongst this to discuss whether or not to take strike action. And what they decided out of that were all the ways to try and scare workers to make them not want to take that necessary action that would have been absolutely crucial in trying to defeat Walker. Instead, they came up with their failing strategy, which was to try and recall all the Republican politicians, and in the course of those elections, elect Democrats instead, right? Now, mind you, the Democrats had not opposed the massive amount of cuts that were coming down alongside this trade union legislation. You can't fully blame them for that, because the trade union leaders didn't oppose the cuts that were coming down with this legislation as well. In fact, they thought it was clever to say they accepted the cuts, but just didn't accept these undemocratic attacks on union rights. But what happened was, as people mobilized into the struggle, the demand for no cuts, no concessions put forward by the nurses union were massively popular. And also, the tactic of a general strike was widely discussed in the Wisconsin working class that was almost solely put forward by the tiny organization in Wisconsin called Socialist Alternative. But what they were able to do, because of the lack of an activist base that could put meat on the bones of the call for a general strike, is that they were able to direct the struggle into the safe channels of the elections and trying to get Democratic Party politicians elected. And this failed. This failed. The Democrats didn't even win a majority of the elections despite the mass uprising. And that's because there was nothing inspiring about these Democrats that were running against Governor Walker. It was more of the same. It was more cuts. It was more attacks on unions. It was more selling out to the Wall Street politicians. And what we say in Socialist Alternative is that the Democratic Party is a dead end for social struggle. In fact, worse than that, it's a graveyard of social struggles throughout history. That when struggle gets directed towards electing Democratic Party politicians, that's often when you see the things that could actually change society. The protests, the strikes, the mass direct action, the occupations. That's when you often see them die down. And the Democrats are not just tied to Wall Street. The Democrats are tied to Wall Street by thousands of different strings, and they're puppet strings that fully control the party, right? And also when we see things like the Tea Party arise and wonder why something that is seemingly so crazy would capture so many people's imaginations in US society and US politics, it's because right-wing populism has a base to grow when there's no organized force amongst working class people that can deal with the issues underneath the surface of why right-wing populism arises. The issues of poverty, the issues of alienation, the issues of more and more people feeling like the people that they've elected have nothing to do with the way they live and the way they could improve their lives. So you had this very strange situation in 2010 of the Tea Party, this grouping of ultra-austerity, being the pole of attraction for opposition to big business candidates in politics as usual. But now the Occupy movement has shaken everything up. You see that the Occupy movement is 2 times as popular as the Tea Party in US society right now. The Occupy movement is more popular than Obama. And deadly diseases are more popular than the US Congress. US Congress has an approval rating of 9% right now. And if we're looking at Obama, I think that is a significant statistic that the Occupy movement is more popular than Obama, but it doesn't tell the full story. Because Obama in 2008 did not win as a lesser evil candidate, right? Obama embodied a massive amount of hope for the future that people had after 8 years of the Bush administration, amongst tens of millions of young people, of black workers, of trade unionists. Barack Obama wasn't just someone to vote for. He was someone that they placed a huge amount of hopes for the future in. And yet, what you saw was, again, not just selling out to Wall Street, but merely going along with the puppet strings that we're pulling in and implementing a cabinet directly representing the Goldman Sachs and the 400 billionaires in US society. So what's going on with Obama is that in 2012, many of those same folks who voted for him will still vote for him, but it's a completely different type of vote. People are not going to feel proud, they're not going to feel energetic, they're not going to want to pull all their friends to the voting stations with them. They're going to vote for him as a lesser evil. And also, extremely importantly, are those millions of people who voted for Obama that have completely broken with the Democratic Party altogether. And in the Occupy movement, it's not just that the hopes in Obama have faded, it's that there's a visceral anger at the Democratic Party in its full, and Obama is included in that. An example of this is that on May 1st of this year, on May Day, International Workers' Day, like every year, there will be mass immigrants' rights protests of tens of thousands of Latino workers. There will also be, because of the Occupy movement, probably thousands of youth and trade unionists coming out onto the streets as well. And the most popular chant that they'll overwhelmingly be chanting is Obama, escucha, estamos en la lucha, which means Obama, listen, we're in a fight. That is very different than the consciousness that existed 4 years ago or even 2 years ago when we're looking at that. And I think it's worth noting here in talking about the visceral anger of Occupy against the Democrats and Obama, that the Occupy movement is this massive thing that I've talked about in terms of the support it has in society, but the actual numbers participating in demonstrations is not nearly as high as movements we've seen in the US in the last 10 years, right? The anti-war movement in 2003 at its height had well over 1 million people, probably 2 million people out in the streets. Even more so, the immigrants' rights movement in 2006 and many, many millions out in the streets that included mass direct action, port shutdowns, mass strikes in many cities throughout the country, right? But I would argue that even though the biggest demonstrations of the Occupy movement have only been numbered in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands or millions, that it's actually more important. Because it's a prelude to what's coming. Bringing these class-conscious slogans to the fore, and also having this determined type of action. Not a one-day protest where you go, you listen to speeches, and you go home. Not just a strike around a specific workplace issue, but a massive determined movement that people are willing to make a tremendous amount of sacrifice in an ongoing struggle against the ruling class in US society. And that's why it has potential going forward, is to bring to the surface the class issues in society that are going to be the basis for massive uprisings in the future. And also, I would argue that it has a tremendous amount of potential because of the tactics brought to the fore. Now, obviously, there's huge limits to the encampments themselves. This idea, it's almost a reliving of the old debate from the 19th century about socialism, utopian, and scientific, right? You're not going to create some better society just in an encampment. You need to mobilize working people and youth to fight capitalism. But the tactic of Occupy is not just something that will be discussed about setting up tents and camps. It will be discussed when there's layoffs coming. People will discuss occupying the workplaces that are being faced with layoffs. It'll be discussed when transit cuts are coming. People will discuss occupying the turnstiles so that people can get through for the transit cuts. This has a tremendous amount of potential because of bringing the class issues to the fore and also determined tactics as well. The discussion around Occupy and discussing inequality has affected even the heights of the Republican Party. If you want to call it heights, maybe you could call it depths, of the Republican Party primaries. Key strategists for the Republican Party, these very nice people like Karl Rove, have told candidates that they should avoid the word capitalism, they should avoid the word capitalist when talking about any of their policies, right? This is at a time when their audience is Republican voters. They don't want to discuss capitalism or capitalists. You have the extremely strange sight of Rick Santorum in Iowa going around and coming out of nowhere to win the Iowa caucuses by talking about the fact that his father's a coal miner and he knows what it means to be a working class person. If comrades want to do some research on Santorum, I'd advise you not to do that with your children in the room. But also, more shockingly, in the last few days, Newt Gingrich came from only, I think, a close race with Romney, predicted to lose, came out of nowhere to win with 40% of the vote, right? Newt Gingrich is talking about capitalism, and he's talking about Mitt Romney being a heartless capitalist, right? I guess the advisors told them, don't talk about capitalism unless you're saying it in a really negative way. And even amongst the Republican voting base in South Carolina, that's what propels Gingrich to victory. Even Romney wants to get in on the act. Romney recently in a speech said that his campaign isn't run by lobbyists, to which one of the reporters stood up and said, I'm sorry, actually, it is run by lobbyists. So you see how all aspects of society have been affected by the way this discussion has unfolded, and as was mentioned in the introduction as well, this having an international impact. And maybe we're honored to, I don't want to put them on the spot, but we're honored to have comrades from the Democratic Socialist Movement in Nigeria that can maybe bring that into the discussion as well about the impact that that's had on the struggle there. So in this situation, and looking at the 2012 elections, it might seem that it's amazing considering how the hero worship of Obama in 2008, it might be amazing to consider that he actually could lose this election. But what's amazing than the fact that he could lose this election is the fact that he could win. No sitting US president has ever come close to winning an election in which they oversee an economy with double-digit unemployment. The real unemployment isn't just in double digits in the US, it's in high double digits, right? And yet the elections appear close. The reason for this is that all the institutions of US capitalism have lost authority, from the banks to the Democratic Party to the Republican Party as well. They have this legacy of the Bush years that they've completely written out of their history, of course. But then more recently, the very phenomenon that helped propel them to an election victory in 2010 is now a complete embarrassment to them, the Tea Party, right? And I think it's telling that this could still be a close election despite that. Because they're all discredited. And you see in this phenomenon that there could be the basis of a right-wing candidate outside the Republican Party gaining an echo and getting some votes, right? You see this figure, Ron Paul, one of the few that have stuck around the Republican primary process. And Ron Paul, one of the reasons that Ron Paul has stuck around for so long is because he poses as the most anti-establishment candidate. Ron Paul is against the wars. Ron Paul is against the big banks. Ron Paul is against the bloated racist US prison system. Ron Paul is against the attacks on civil liberties. What Ron Paul is for, more than any other candidate, is austerity, right? And this is the way that they're trying to find some basis for right-wing ideas. It's for posing as anti-establishment on every single issue except the issue that'll matter most to working class people, which is the massive attacks on living standards that are taking place. So there's this space, there's this massive vacuum because of the discrediting of the two main parties, right? But unfortunately, the left is not posed to take advantage of this opportunity. There's a huge vacuum to the point that I think a left candidate outside of the two parties of big business could get more of a vote than percentage-wise than Nader in 2000, and it's maybe the biggest opportunity for a left challenge in the elections, the biggest opportunity since 1920, when Eugene Debs, socialist candidate, got 1 million votes from jail. But right now, there is no Eugene Debs in US society. There is no socialist figure, working class leader that is an everyday figure that people can relate to. There's not even a left populist of the profile that Nader had in 2000 either. So we see actually that this opportunity to be taken, especially if a lot of the folks in the Occupy movement that have some authority right now abstain from politics, that this opportunity will widely be missed, that this vacuum will go unfilled or, in a more dangerous way, be partially filled by a right-wing candidate posing as anti-establishment. So with this situation where there's not likely, well, let me just touch on a couple things actually before I get into that. Sorry, my notes aren't as good. They had stuff to do. But there's also the potential that a capitalist candidate, because of the massive vacuum that there is, a capitalist candidate could actually challenge from the left outside of the two parties. And it's unclear to us yet that Rocky Anderson is a former mayor of Salt Lake City. He's talking about establishing a new political party, but does not talk in the terms that could make a massive impact right now, which are the terms of the Occupy movement, of the masses of people struggling against the corporate profiteers and politicians that have hijacked our society. But also the fact that there's not a mass working class party, which is what we call for in the United States and what we strategically try to provide the framework for, means that we would support the strongest left candidate that's independent of big business as well. And the Occupy movement, it wasn't just a clear working class movement, right? But the key thing is to engage with it, to point forward the methods that can actually win victories for working people. And we'd aim to do the same thing if there was an independent left challenge that was clearly outside the influence of big business. But despite this massive vacuum, this hasn't come forward. So in this situation, it's actually even possible for socialists to make an impact, in the electoral sphere. And an example of this is in 2010, the independent candidate that got the biggest vote for Congress was actually an openly socialist candidate. Now, normally we wouldn't pay attention to all these different groups running candidates against each other, all claiming to be socialists. But actually, if there was united candidacy, if the socialists left in US society, it could make an impact because of the way the term is being discussed within the Occupy movement, the popularity that socialism has amongst black workers, amongst young people as well. But unfortunately, despite the fact that we argued at a conference of different socialist groups for a united candidate, we're going to have the same situation of, despite the massive vacuum that existed, of people just looking for their own interests, of their little groups running against each other. But the fact that we would even take that process seriously shows how much things have changed. It shows the potential for building around socialist ideas in US society. It shows the very real prospect of class struggle going forward and of Marxists to be able to make a massive impact on it. Now, I don't want to leave this discussion open without addressing the question that I think is on a lot of folks' minds, is who's likely to win this election? I think Mitt Romney, despite the fact that the Republican base would like to find anyone else to try and destroy this creature that is Mitt Romney's campaign, Mitt Romney is the likely candidate of the Republican Party. The candidate of the Democratic Party is decided because there is no real left in the Democratic Party to challenge the candidate of the Democratic Party. Although this is a bit of a side note, but the ruling class in the US was actually scared of that. They were afraid of someone, because of the massive disappointment with Obama, they were scared of someone actually challenging Obama in the Democratic primaries. But that venue of discussion of ideas, if you want to call it that, has been cinched up by big business to be impenetrable from any discussion. But it's difficult to say who will win this election. And the reason it's difficult to say is obviously the tumultuous world events that have happened in the past year are likely to continue. As it's not just an economic crisis, it's a social crisis, it's a political crisis, not just in the US, but around the world. And these tumultuous events could have a massive impact one way or another on the elections. Whether that's the economy taking another turn for the worse, whether that's potential conflict with Iran, etc. But a crucial thing that makes this election so hard to predict is the fact that neither of these political parties has any authority amongst the broad mass of people that they used to be able to mobilize for their voting base. Whether that's the people that mobilized for Obama in 2008, whether that's the folks that mobilized for the Tea Party in 2010, etc. And the key question in front of people going into the voting booths in the US is not who to vote for, it's who to vote against. And you'll see people, in the voting booth just trying to figure out who's worse of the two, and having their views based around that, and the outcome of the election being based around that as well. But what we do know is that there's a massive potential to build movements in the US that can have an impact again going forward. And the Occupy movement, despite all the police repression that got rid of the encampments, despite going into a lull over the holidays, despite a certain exhaustion that was there over the intense struggle that people had to defend their encampments and to try and build the movement as well, an exhaustion that partially came from a lack of strategy among some of the leading activists too. That it's a coming to the surface of the class anger in society that will be expressed in one form or another, and that will be expressed in explosive ways, like the explosive movement of the Wisconsin working class seemingly coming out of nowhere, coming out of a time with lower strike figures year after year. The way you figure out what year has the lowest strike figures in US history is by figuring out what year you're in, 2011, lowest strike figures ever. 2010, lowest strike figures ever. 2009, lowest strike figures ever. But what happened is the Wisconsin working class rose up in a way that nobody expected. And that's likely to what we'll again see going forward, of course with its ups and downs, but what we'll again see going forward, because the occupation isn't over. Just today, there's a strike, a very small strike, out in Longview, Washington, of dock workers. And just today, a ship was coming in of grain onto the dock. And actually, these workers have been scabbed on by, unfortunately, folks in another union who are replacing them right now. When this ship approaches the dock, there's going to be a huge battle. The US, the president has called in the Coast Guard, has called in helicopters to try and protect this ship, has called in the National Guard to try and protect this ship. The union's responding with a determined fight back that people will do whatever it takes to stop that ship unloading. once it's unloaded, people try and do whatever it takes to stop the grain from getting onto the tracks, the train tracks where it has to be transported. But sometimes the balance of forces is such that we can't win no matter how determined the action is. But it's not just the labor movement that's rallying to this cause. It's the Occupy movement that wants to shut down the ports as the boat comes in, which is likely actually happening during the course of this meeting. So that shows that the Occupy movement, the determined struggle, the inspiring character hasn't been lost. And actually at the university that I went to, I almost said graduated from, which would have been captured on tape. The university that I went to in Boston, UMass Boston, I just got news before I left that the university's been occupied, right? And this is the school I went to. 98% of the people that go to school there are working at the same time, right? It's a very working class environment. They're occupying not just in general around the 1% and the 99%. We'll see more of this. People got impatient about when's the movement going to have demands. There will be demands because the movement is going to be taking up concrete class issues. There are demands against privatization, demands against the parking fee increases, demands against the larger class sizes that were coupled also with the trade union demands while they're in contract negotiations. That Occupy started today, and that's going to be the music of the future going forward. It's going to be the struggles around concrete issues that working class people face with determined action to try and win victories. And in that context is where the ideas of Marxism as a guide to action will be able to take on new forms as we see the opportunities to build a socialist organization, not just in the US, but also around the world. So I want to thank the comrades for letting me come and speak here in London, and I look forward to the discussion.